Good morning, everyone. My name is Hedi Ouardani and I work with Socium's Talent Management Solutions team. Today we're going to be discussing a topic on the tips of everyone's tongue, IR35. And thankfully I'm joined by an expert in compliance and payroll, Julia.kermode. Julia is the CEO of the FCSA, the Freelancer and Contractor Services Association, which is a professional membership body dedicated to raising supply chain standards and promoting compliance in the supply chain for the temporary labour market. Julia is one of the few people that you're likely to see on your LinkedIn feed this week who's actually qualified to have an opinion on IR35. So I'm particularly excited to have her here to pick her brain. So thank you for joining us, Julia.
You're really welcome. I'm always very happy to talk about IR35.
Great. It's a rare occurrence, but that's great. Well, IR35 is obviously a very big topic and it's a very topical thing in the industry right now. It's effectively the GDPR of 2019 and 2020.
Yeah.
Everyone's talking about it and everyone's concerned about it. But for anyone who might have been living under a rock for the last 2 years or arguably the last 19 years, can you give us an overview of what IR35 is, why it came about and who should really be concerned with it?
Yeah, so the legislation is designed to prevent people working as self-employed if they look more like employees. And so that is it in a nutshell. And if you are inside IR35 or caught by IR35, then you need to be paying a payment to HMRC that's more or less equivalent to the tax that would have been paid if you were an employee. It came about almost 20 years ago now, where HMRC believed that a lot of businesses were making staff redundant or whatever. They basically staff were leaving work on the Friday from being employed and then coming back on Monday as a self-employed person, and the businesses were then saving costs on employers' national insurance, and then sometimes people were then getting a higher pay rate perhaps by being self-employed because they then don't have benefits of employment, so no holiday pay, sick pay, etc. And so it was kind of dealing with that potential issue that is why IR35 legislation came in. And it's quite complicated, but basically it looks at several different factors to see whether someone looks more like an employee rather than self-employed.
Right, and so which businesses in particular do you think are going to have to concern themselves with IR35?
So it's going to come to the fore from next year, where all businesses will need to be aware of IR35, or at least all businesses that engage with contractors on a freelance or self-employed basis. And the change that's coming is that the businesses using those contractors will be responsible for determining if someone is inside IR35, whereas at the moment, within the private sector, it's that individual who is responsible for determining if they're inside IR35 or not. So in a nutshell, the change means that all businesses engaging a contractor will be determining whether that contractor looks more like an employee or not. And the legislation is quite complex and it's quite a lot for businesses to get used to. And I think there's quite a lot of work we can do as a sector to help businesses get ready for the change.
Right, so effectively HMRC wants businesses to perform these assessments on their contingent workers and non-permanent workers to see whether or not they should in fact fall inside IR35.
That's it, exactly. And the reason why I'm saying it's quite complicated is that HMRC and employment lawyers don't always agree on what being inside IR35 looks like, and there's been some tribunals recently that HMRC have lost, and you sort of think, well, hang on, if HMRC and employment lawyers don't agree on what it looks like, how on earth is a normal business supposed to get to grips with it? But yet, nevertheless, we expect this legislation change to come from April next year, and we'll have to get used to it and deal with it.
So the HMRC do have the online CES tool. I think it's Check Employment Status for Tax.
Yes,
that's what it stands
that's
for.
Right.
It's come under quite a bit of scrutiny recently, as I understand. And what I'm curious to know is if you use the tool, or if a business uses the tool, and it says that somebody is outside of IR35 and they've answered all the questions correctly, will HMRC stand by that in the event that they go to assess that candidate later? Or
yes, they will. They're going through a process at the moment of updating the CEST tool because it hasn't always been viewed as being the best. But nevertheless, HMRC have said that they will stand by the results of the tool, providing, as you say, that information has been inputted correctly and accurately.
Right. So in the latest consultation that was released just a few months ago, back in May, there was a lot of concern over how the assessment's made and whether or not the candidate should have a say in that determination. As it stands, I understand that the end user, which is the client in this case, is making the assessment. But can the candidate object to that, or is there a process in which they can challenge that assessment?
At the moment, there's no official process, and we actually think that there should be a process that is mediated through HMRC or another independent organisation, an official appeals process, but there isn't one. And the changes that are planned to come in for next year are going to be requiring the client to have a mediation process. So the contractor can say to the client, hang on a minute, I don't agree with your determination, and then the client has to tell them the reasons why. Clients don't have to change their decision, but there's a view that within the changes that have already come out to the public sector, that there wasn't enough of that contact with the contractor, and so the HMRC are aware there's no appeals process. They're not going to put one in, and so they're basically going to leave that to the client to deal with.
To determine. So there were quite a few lessons learned and mistakes made, I think, from the public sector rollout. Do you know what lessons have been learned that are going to be applied to the private sector? Are they going to differ in their approach in any way?
I think so. One of the major things we saw with the public sector were blanket assessments, whereby public sector clients ruled a large number of their workforce inside IR35 without looking at it on a case-by-case basis. And that meant that some people were unfairly put inside IR35 and taxed accordingly. And actually, the legislation really requires you to look at it on an individual case-by-case basis. And so now the planned changes for next year are going to require clients to take reasonable care. And that's hope that the plan is that will stop there being blanket assessments taking place. So again, it's putting the onus on the client to make that determination and to take into account the individual factors for that person doing the role.
Right, so blanket assessments are kind of a no-no. You shouldn't really be doing them as a business if you can help it.
Yeah, it's not helpful for your workforce, and it's not helpful for that business's reputation. I think as an industry we understand why it happened in the public sector, because the HMRC's CEST tool didn't come out until very, very late, and so actually a lot of public sector businesses had no real option. They had to make a determination, and they didn't have the help and support available to them, whereas the changes coming for next year really shouldn't be making blanket assessments. There is no reason to do that, providing you allow yourself enough time to assess your contingent workforce before these changes come in April.
Right, so in the event that any businesses are very up to date on IR35 and they've already got their processes in place, and they start to require new talent and new roles, and they assess that role prior to actually hiring anybody, and they deem that role to be outside of IR35, are they required, or is it simply just good practice for them to pass on that assessment to any recruitment agencies or third-party staffing suppliers that they use to say, we've got this role, can you go and find us a candidate, and we believe it's going to fall outside of IR35 for these reasons?
Yep, I think that's really, really good practice, and it will enable the recruiters to advertise the role accordingly, and it will enable the fee payer, which is the body that will be paying that contractor, to know what they're likely to be paying, because the fee payer is responsible in the eyes of the legislation for deducting appropriate tax and national insurance if they're inside IR35, but if they're outside IR35, then that individual can be paid gross. So yeah, I think it's really, really good practice to do what I would call an indicative assessment at the outset, and to advertise the role accordingly, and then once that individual is in place, and once you know who will be doing the role, you probably want to do another assessment just to make sure that it hasn't changed from being outside to inside.
Right, that's terrific. And to go back a moment, you spoke about fee payer.
Yeah.
Are we talking about a recruitment agency or a payroll company?
Could be either.
Could be either.
Yeah.
So in the event that it's a payroll company and they sit somewhere on the supply chain, you've got the end client, the user, what we call the end user, possibly an MSP or possibly just a larger agency or a sole supplier agency, and then you've got the payroll company, and then you've got the end candidate. I understand from the recent consultation period that if the end client does not communicate their assessment or their determination for that candidate, then the responsibility of collecting those taxes will not fall with the fee payer. It will stay with the end client. Is that correct?
Yes, that's it in a nutshell. And I know some of the supply chains can be quite long, and so the idea is that liability for the tax will cascade down the supply chain as everyone communicates the determination down the supply chain. But if that communication doesn't happen, then the buck will stop with the end client.
And what do, from your conversations you've had in the industry, how do recruitment agencies feel about the IR35 and how it's going to impact them? What are their main concerns? Have you heard of any core ones?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of concern about this rolling liability and how businesses will be able to prove that they have passed that determination on. And so there's going to be quite a bit of record keeping needed. Yeah. So that you as a business can confirm that you have fulfilled your duties. And then the next kind of issue with recruiters is around getting the right skills in and the right talent in to the end clients, and how best to advertise the role and how their own setup is organised. So it's going to make things quite uncertain, but hopefully it will also bring about a bit of clarity and a bit more awareness of compliance in the supply chain. Because you've got this rolling liability, you're going to want to know that the next firm down the chain isn't suddenly going to go bust or something like that, because then that liability can come back up the chain as well, or at least that's how it's planned in the consultation that's just been finished.
Right, in theory. So in the public sector, when IR35 was introduced, there's a lot of data to suggest that organisations were missing out on talent because they were moving. The talent was moving to the private sector.
Yes.
Contractors wanted to remain that way as contractors, and that's resulted in costs to their projects. Do you anticipate that less compliant businesses who don't address IR35 until the 11th hour or at all are likely to benefit from having contractors come towards them from a talent perspective who want to remain that way? Do you think that if you adopt IR35 too soon and you're an early adopter, are you gonna miss out and potentially lose talent in the early stages?
You shouldn't do. It's all about making those determinations and knowing who you're working with. And I think the sooner that firms are on board with it, the better. Because some businesses use a large number of contingent workers, and so they've got a lot of assessments to do. So I would recommend they get started on those now. In terms of the kind of ostrich approach, burying their head in the sand, I don't think they will benefit, because they will suddenly have this legal responsibility that they're going to have to deal with, like it or not. And if they take a very risky approach by just saying everyone's outside IR35, then I think that will come back to bite them, to be honest with you, because HMRC are very well aware of the impact of the changes that they're bringing in, and they will be looking out for people that are not taking that reasonable care. And I think that companies who are not ready for the changes can't possibly show they've taken reasonable care, and I think they're then exposing themselves to a really significant tax risk.
Right. What are the core assessment factors that people are looking at, like mutuality of obligation? What are the core tenets of whether or not someone falls inside or outside of IR35? Are they based on case law, or are savvy firms starting to base the determinations on recent case law, or is there a kind of set process for?
It's all based on case law, and there's about 20 years worth of of IR35 cases, but there are major factors that need to be considered when looking at IR35 status, and there's things like mutuality of obligations, which you've already said, which is in very basic terms the ongoing obligation for a client to provide ongoing work for someone, and that worker's right obligation to do that work. So in an employment situation, your employer has an obligation to provide you with work and you have to do it, whereas in a self-employed position there isn't that ongoing mutuality of obligation, and there's been whole books written about mutuality of obligation, so it is a bit complicated, and that leads me to a slightly different point in terms of the HMRC's CEST tool does not take into account mutuality of obligation, and they feel that mutuality of obligation is always there in any contractual arrangement for a contingent worker to be working for a client. Now, case law suggests that's not the case, as does almost everyone in the industry suggest that is not the case in reality, and there's been a lot of lobbying by lots of different groups for HMRC to update the tool to include stuff around mutuality of obligation. They recently lost a tribunal on mutuality of obligation, and hopefully they will take on board the feedback. The problem they've got is that it's complicated. Yeah,
sure. It's hard to factor that into a piece of technology when there are other variables and grey areas. Yeah. Sure. So to wrap things up, what do you think the key steps are that businesses can take today to kind of familiarise themselves with IR35 and start to begin the process if they haven't yet done so? Yeah,
so businesses really need to be looking at who's working for them at the moment. The changes will be coming in from April next year, and it affects everyone that is paid after the start of the new tax year in April. So you could have people working for your business in March who that will apply to, and you need to get your IR35 determinations clear before those payments are made in April next year. So as the first step, you need to be looking at who is in your business on a contingent basis. That might sound easy, but it's actually not, because some big businesses will have hiring managers who just bring in someone to do whatever tasks, whatever assignments need doing, and there isn't necessarily a central record of who all these contingent workers are, because they don't always go through a centralised HR route, because they are not part of that permanent employees mix. So just identifying them is a difficult job in itself. Also, depending on the size of the business, you will probably want to get a bit of an IR35 working group together to start looking at this workforce. You want to start communicating with the workforce as well that will be affected. You probably want to look at getting some advisors on board to help work through the determinations, because I know in some cases there are thousands of contingent workers in the business, and so each of those needs to have an IR35 determination, and as we've already talked about, the industry itself doesn't always agree on what a determination looks like. You might have one view and then it might go to tribunal and the end result might be a different view, as HMRC know. So just doing all of that is actually quite a lot of work, but I would say that there are a lot of professionals out there who know this industry who are able to help and advise businesses and help them navigate it, because I think it will be tricky. I think once it beds in, everyone will get used to it and it will therefore kind of settle down. But I think between now and April next year, we all need to work together to get ready.
Sure. So just one more question. In the outcome that a business makes a determination of their contingent workforce and so a large portion of them fall inside IR35 and the contractors stay and everything goes well and they're happy to switch over, can HMRC backtrack for taxes lost on that workforce, and will they?
They are saying that they won't. So that is what they are saying. However, it is a potential risk for that contractor. It wouldn't be a risk for the client, because before these changes come in next year, the responsibility for determining IR35 is with that individual contractor. So it would be their risk, not the client's risk. And HMRC have said they will not automatically look at retrospective tax for someone that is inside IR35 from April onwards.
Is it worth businesses making the change, making the assessments in advance, but then making the change just prior to April? Or is it better to make the change now, in your opinion?
That's a tricky one. If it was me, I'd be making the changes as soon as possible, and looking at the role and the contract. But of course, what's most important is not the role title or the contract; it's the working practices. So if there is a HMRC investigation, that is where they will base most of their opinion on, is what's taking place in practice within that business. So any changes that are being made, I would suggest you want to get in place before Christmas. So if you think about it, assess your workforce now, be considering what changes might need to be made, and get as much done as you can before the end of the year. So then it's all bedded in before April next year.
Great, well, thanks so much. I think it's obviously going to be quite a big headache for a lot of businesses, but I think the IR35, the optimist in me, said that there are some silver linings. Like you suggested, you're forced to look at what is typically an invisible workforce, your contingent labour, and centralise the process of managing it. And you can involve different stakeholders across the business, whether it's procurement or talent acquisition, compliance and HR, to say, let's look at our contingent workforce. Let's look at the skills that we typically recruit for and what we go outside the business for. Can we look at our permanent staff and upskill them? Can we involve learning and development in this process? There are different stakeholders who I think don't realise they can have some kind of impact in addressing IR35. Procurement, of course, want to look at the costs associated with adopting, with assessing IR35, and maybe even looking at their supply chain to make sure, they've got the best suppliers who are supplying the best talent at the most competitive fees.
Absolutely.
And although I think there are going to be some costs, with regards to, adopting, falling inside IR35, I think a lot of businesses might be quite surprised when they, peel back the layers of their supply chain and realise, look at their fees and what they're being charged for contingent workers, because in some cases businesses don't know they pay all-in rates. So it's forcing businesses to really look and put a microscope on that supply chain and affect the strategy of their contingent workforce. So there are ramifications that are down the line that can be quite helpful.
Yeah, I think so, and I think the kind of cross-cutting approach is really important, and I think that businesses need to be aware that in order to make sure that they're working with a compliant supply chain, I would say cost is important, but actually I'd be slightly alarmed if something that says that they're working compliantly is kind of too cheap, because actually running your business as an intermediary and a recruitment firm too cheaply might suggest that they're not as compliant as perhaps they're saying. So I'd be a bit savvy about that if I was a client business. But I think the points about everyone working together is really important. I think some of the stuff we've been doing at FCSA, we've seen part of a business making really good, thorough IR35 determinations, but then being overruled by another part of the business that's actually working with those contractors on a daily basis. And that situation is really not helpful. And I think some of the people making the overruling decisions probably don't realise the impact of what they're doing. So I think a cross-organisational approach, if possible, is the best way forward. Because normally you're paying for advice or one way or another, and so to get that advice in and then not listen to it, I think is just daft.
That's great. Thanks so much for joining me and letting me pick your brain. I'm sure that when the draft finance bill comes out after the summer, there might be an opportunity to get together again and see what's come out of that as a result of the last consultation.
Be really happy to. Awesome. Thank you.
So thanks very much for watching. If you have any questions about developing your contingent workforce strategy in conjunction with compliance and IR35 particularly, please do get in touch with myself and Julia. Our contact details will be attached to the video, and feel free to comment and like and share accordingly if you found it helpful. Thank you.